Johnson. Thank you so much for staying with us. Let's go back overseas. Our friend Sam Lewis, he's a Young Voices contributor, a commentator. You can catch him on places like GB News and other outlets. He also runs his own blog. Kind of a specialist on Asia, has actually lived over there and traveled. Sir, how are you? Appreciate your time today.
I'm very well, Andrew. Thanks so much for having me on.
We're thrilled to have you on short notice too, so I appreciate you very much. Lots of China in the news right now, but let's take a step back and make sure everybody's nomenclature on what we're talking about with China is correct. We have the Chinese Communist Party. We have China, the massive country, the largest country in the world population wise. We have the Chinese economy, and then we have the global politics of all this. It makes kind of a hot mess when you go to talk and advocate and discuss issues relating to China, that those are all factors when we just say China, doesn't it?
Oh, 100%. I think the thing about China is it's been around for many thousands of years, has a wonderful history, wonderful culture. The people are very friendly. And if you go there, you'll be welcome. They welcome you like a family. You know, I remember I spent a good few years there and I loved my time there. So many friends from it. And yet, you know, it gets a lot of stick in the media, and most of that is because of the people that run it. The people that run it, the Communist Party, that simply don't want to play along with international rules, that want to change the international order and want to effectively do bad things to the world. And ultimately, we need to find a way to separate that, because a lot of people don't. And when you don't separate things, we don't understand the nuance. When you don't understand that there are, you know, different parts of China, that there are different opinions within China, they're just not expressed all the time. If you treat them as one big blob, then well, we're not going to get anywhere in international relations, and we're not going to improve relations anytime in the next few years.
This is particularly touchy. I know I try to be cognizant of it. I mess up too. When I'm doing my advocacy, especially when I'm being critical of the ruling powers in China, to make sure I delineate that from the Chinese people, because the Chinese Communist Party and leaders, Xi Jinping, these folks, that's a major thing for them. They purposely want to make sure those two things, there's no separation and they are one and the same. So it's even more incumbent on us in Western media, or those of us that have freedom of speech and have platforms. It's really important that we do that, isn't it? Because this gets to the very heart of what their plans and policies for some of the more untoward stuff they're doing, isn't it?
Well, yeah, the thing is that they try to claim Chinese people around the world. You know, if you live in Singapore, or if you live in America and you're Chinese, if you were born in these places that are nowhere near China, they seem to think that you should think the same way that the Chinese Communist Party does. And it's obviously absolutely wrong. You know, everyone has their own opinion. You can be Chinese and think for yourself. You don't have to think what the Communist Party says. And we just need to be clear that that's the case. And we can't mix them up as much, because there are lots of people out there, especially from Hong Kong and from within China, who do think like we do in the West, and ultimately want to be part of the debate, just they're stopped from being part of the debate within China.
You've actually been there. How would you explain the scale of China to them, population wise, land mass wise? This is a huge part of our globe. You're talking about, you know, a billion people. You know, their economic might comes from having a 750 million strong workforce. Just nobody else has anything close to that. You've actually been on the ground there. How would you explain scale? Because I think sometimes, especially in Western media, we're talking about them like they're just another country, but just by the math, they're really not.
Oh, 100%. I mean, if you look at how China is composed, it's effectively got 32 provinces, 4 of which are huge cities. And these places are, you know, they have hundreds of cities. You know, in the UK, we might have a couple of cities. I think we have 4 cities which are above 1 million people. Over there, it's hundreds of cities that have over 1 million people. And the fact is that because it's such a large country of 1.4 billion, there's a lot of different dialects. There's a lot of different food, cuisine. You know, the local Chinese down where I am, and the local Chinese where you are, will have a certain form of food, but it's not real Chinese food. Ultimately, you have food from South China, which is a bit spicier. You know, food from the north of China, which is more noodles, less rice, which grows in the south. North east, you have a bit of food which is like Korean food. So there's a lot of different stuff going on. And in fact, a lot of people within Zhejiang, for example, one of the provinces in the center of the country, they wouldn't be able to understand someone from Guangzhou in the south, because they speak different dialects. Shanghainese is different to to Cantonese. And ultimately, that's how Mandarin has come about as a language. This is the language that it's a northern language, but they're taught to all speak it in schools. It's the common language that they all use. So there's a lot of variation, there's a lot of difference, and it all sort of comes together. And there's so many different dynamics going on, and not all people within China are the same.
There's going to be a lot of attention, not just the politics and the diplomatic and the international stuff, but China is once again getting the Olympics. The pressure on that is twofold. One is the world is paying more attention to China besides just the political and policy wonks like us who do it all the time, but also because China, and we just saw this in recent history, they use this as an advertisement. They use this, I'll go ahead and use the word, they use this as propaganda. So this pressure on China and making sure we understand China is going to be even more important going into this next year.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is that this is a soft power victory for them. So America has taken a bold step, as has the UK and some other countries like Lithuania, of not sending diplomats. I think we should have gone further and not sent athletes. But we are where we are. The fact is that China is going to use this as in the same way that Germany did in 1936. This is a way for them to prove that they're part of the world and prove that they're on top. They'll probably win a ton of medals, and they'll use this as nationalistic propaganda locally. And they want to say, "Oh, look, we're all welcoming, we're all open, come and visit," when that's just not the case. And they've spent these last few years bullying smaller nations that disagree with them. And they've also been skimming off countries that have been trying to integrate with the West, and they've been making countries recognize them over Taiwan. And they've been promoting anti-democratic forces locally. Well, two countries on their border have now got governments that are anti-democratic. You have Burma, who had a military coup in the last year, and of course you have Afghanistan, where the Taliban came to power. And China has been slowly but surely sort of allowing the international system to change for the worse, and we've been doing nothing to counter them. And the IOC has decided, even after Peng Shuai came out and said that she'd been sexually assaulted by a senior member of the Communist Party, and the IOC still thought, even though tennis is part of the Olympics, not part of the Winter Olympics, but part of the Olympics, which the IOC runs both of them, obviously, the IOC hasn't pulled out of China, and it's going ahead, and they're just ignoring it. And whenever they're asked questions about it, they just ignore it and think, "Oh no, it doesn't matter." Of course it matters. And if this was a Western country, they'd probably be raising hell about it. But because it's China, they haven't been, and they've been staying silent. And we can't stay silent on these issues anymore. We have to do something. And at least, there's going to be a diplomatic boycott from nations that are leading the way, like America and the UK, but there needs to be more done.
More with Sam Lewis on Hertel right after this. Hertel Radio, thanks for sticking with us. I'm Andrew Donaldson, being joined by Sam Lewis, a Young Voices contributor and expert on Asia. What is the effect practically of the diplomatic boycott by, let's just start with the US, because they're kind of the big name so far to do this. I was one of those. I don't think it goes far enough. I know Beijing and the ruling powers freaked out about it because they hate the optics of it, and they push back strong against absolutely everything. They're very petty in matters like this, but practically, is this really doing anything other than just kind of aggravating the Chinese?
Not really. That's the problem. All it seems to be doing is giving, fire to the flame of wolf warrior diplomacy, which has just taken off in the last 2 years. This they can sell to the public as, "Oh, we're being bullied by the West again. They're not coming along, even though they're sending their athletes." It's not that bad because they're still sending their athletes, but they just want to make a show, and they want to do this, which isn't being that productive, and they will sell this to the public as, "But we're going to go ahead with it anyway. We're standing up to the West, and it doesn't matter what happens." So, I mean, what more can we do? I don't think we should have sent our athletes. Like I say, sport is a big soft power, and people think you should separate sport and politics, but not when the Chinese Communist Party don't do the same. We need to play them at their own game. We need to understand that they're using sport as a means to promote themselves, and we therefore need to use sport as a means to, promote our values and stop. If we all came together, if the EU came together, EU nations, America came together, who else we could persuade within South America, within Asia, not to go along. China would be left with a tournament of what, 20 nations coming together for a little, well, what would effectively be a regional tournament. Russia can't be there anyway because they're not allowed as part of the IOC sanctions that they had. And so, we should have gone further. But in terms of what this particular diplomatic boycott will do practically, very little, unfortunately, I think.
Sam Lewis joined us on Heard Tell. I bear down on that terminology, though, because it's not just sports. This wolf warrior diplomacy, it's in their diplomats, it's in their mouthpieces, we all see on our social media the state sponsored tag that's all over everything. If you say anything about China now, this is a total full court press on basically all speech everywhere all the time. So why do you call it that wolf warrior diplomacy? Because it really permeates almost everything they're doing right now.
Yeah, so this sort of started a few years ago. I mean, the one diplomat that really comes to mind is a guy called Zhao Lijian, who works at the foreign office within China. Now, a few years ago, he was at an embassy. I forget where. I think it was somewhere in South America. But he was effectively, he wrote on Twitter something which an ambassador shouldn't, or someone within the embassy shouldn't. It wasn't very diplomatic, and he was told off for it. And yet he sort of went home, and a year later he reappeared within their foreign office, and it's just sort of taken off after that. And I think behind the scenes, the Chinese have sort of said, you know what, we don't really care what people think about us anymore. We just got to show ourselves to be strong and powerful, and it's about having a strong presence and having a strong ability to sort of scare other nations. So there's a big factor within China, both within society and within politics, of saving face. It's about effectively, it's all about pride. It's about showing yourself to be strong, and that you won't collapse under scrutiny from anybody else. And yet they haven't found the subtle difference between being confident in yourself and just coming across as very arrogant. And I think a lot of it's become lost in translation, and they've simply this is daytime radio, so I won't say the word that's on my mind, but they're not being very subtle about it, and they're acting very in a not very diplomatic way, let's put it that way.
Yeah, we're talking to Sam Lewis. We're talking China, some international issues with them, the Olympics, Peng Shuai, some other things. We'll be right back with him on Heard Tell Radio right after this. Heard Tell Radio, thanks for sticking with us. I'm Andrew Donaldson, being joined by Sam Lewis, a Young Voices contributor and expert on Asia. Talking China, we're talking about all the untoward stuff here. The thing that has kind of broke through some of the media coverage lately, and because sports and Olympics is on the mind, is the Peng Shuai thing. She disappeared after a allegation of sexual assault against the former vice premier, Zhang, I believe his name's pronounced. She disappears for 3 months. Now she's reappeared with a lot of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, because she just happened to be at a state-sponsored event with a state-sponsored media person asking her questions, with lots of Chinese celebrities that are supportive of the regime surrounding her. I have been saying we have been watching somebody be re-educated right in front of our very eyes. Is that too harsh, or does that sound about right to you?
No, but I think you've hit the nail on the head there. She's basically been, she posted on Weibo, which is their equivalent of Facebook, this long sort of blog, basically explaining this sexual assault that happened to her. And within a few minutes, it was taken down, not before screenshots were taken, of course, but an account was suspended, and she suddenly disappeared for a month or two. And there's precedent to this. Jack Ma 2 years ago started to talk up about how Chinese regulators were actually, ruining his business plans, and that they had to change the way they were doing things. And, freedom of expression is not a thing within China. That's a big no-no. You can't do that unless you're attacking a foreign nation, in which case, be free as you like to say what you want. Or if you're attacking Tesla, be free as you like to say what you want. That can go viral. But if you're attacking anything to do with the Chinese Communist Party, that is not allowed. And in Jack Ma's case, he disappeared for a couple of months. and then had to do sort of, I think the Chinese equivalent of community service. He had to take a couple of educational lessons, take a couple of make a few videos explaining, why China's the best place to do business, etc. And you see this with a lot of other sort of rich, famous people. China has come down more recently on the worst inequalities of the regime, of which there are many, and they've sort of gone after rich people that don't necessarily pay as much tax as they should. And this is called a common prosperity drive, and some elements of it are very good. I think, yeah, there's a lot of grotesque inequality within China, and they're trying to tackle it, but some of it is just to shut up people that have an opinion for themselves. And in this particular case, they've sort of thrown Peng Shuai in the same end. They've silenced her, and then they tried to row back and say no, she's free to talk. But obviously, she's always got a camera on her, and they know what she's saying, so she can't be truly open. And effectively now we've got to a stage where I think they've realized, we have to let her be free to talk to an extent, because what we tried to do didn't work, and the West has seen through it. And now she's effectively, well, I reckon she was forced to do it, but she's withdrawn her statement that she made about sexual assault. And it's such a shame, because this could be a Chinese Me Too movement. Women are not treated equally in China. Men dominate the political landscape, and it's such a shame that, well, this wasn't really taken to help women's rights within China.
What is it? Because you've been talking about it in your writing and your advocacy, and I have as well. The last couple of years, China has really cranked up domestically, internally, the nationalism. Xi Jinping, of course, with his book out now, and the silliness over the Amazon rating, everybody's kind of laughing about that, but it's part of a pattern. They've really been cranking up on that. They are obsessed over Chinese culture being all about, the one China. And I don't mean the Taiwan policy. I mean, one China as in the party and the people are one. What is it culturally going on in China? Like you said, this is, a missed opportunity for inequalities in China. What culturally has been going on the last couple of years for this? I'll just call it a crackdown, for lack of a better term, where they're getting very obsessive over the nationalistic components to the Chinese Communist Party all of a sudden. What's changed? Is that a cultural change, or did something else happen, or what's driving that?
Well, as you said, I mean, domestically, they've been pursuing this nationalistic rhetoric that's just not been seen since Mao, not been seen since the 50s and 60s. And I think that has something to do with Xi Jinping's ego. I mean, he is now at the end of his second term. He'll most likely be voted in within the internal party voting that goes on. It's very much not a democratic country, but he'll be voted in again for a third term. And it's all about cementing a legacy. The best emperors throughout Chinese history have expanded and consolidated China's territorial gain. And he's pushed this idea of China's national rejuvenation. They're overcoming the century of humiliation, which started with the first Opium War, where China lost Hong Kong to the British, and also Vladivostok to the Russians. Let's not forget that. That's also, people say that Russia and China are best buddies and that there'll never be an issue there. But don't forget, Hong Kong and Vladivostok were lost around the same time. And there are still people within China that want Vladivostok back. Let's not forget that. But this nationalistic rhetoric has just been really upped. It's got to very vile. And I think it's happened after the coronavirus. There must have been a spike in it, simply because, well, firstly, they closed off. So they stopped having as many foreigners coming in. They weren't as open. And they also, once the virus sort of was more abroad than at home, they saw an opportunity to change the narrative, to change the propaganda, to say, actually, this is a foreign disease. This has nothing to do with us. And that's why they came up with the lie of saying that the American military brought it to China. And believe it or not, a lot of people within China believe that lie. And it's disgusting that it's got to that stage. And more recently, I was sent a video, for example, of a kindergarten where I know a friend who works there. And, there were 3, 4, 5-year-olds in front of a screen of, tanks and Chinese military, and they were screaming this nationalistic tune out, and they were waving Chinese flags at the same time. It was very North Korean, but in this case, China has nuclear weapons, and they're teaching their kids that, Taiwan is an integral part and that it's of China, and that it's okay that they invade it. It's as if, and that rejuvenation won't take place until Taiwan comes back into the Chinese family, as if and it doesn't matter what Taiwanese people think; they just want to bring it about. So it's a means of control. There's nothing that really gets people together than a sense of patriotism. At least I think that's what the Chinese Communist Party are betting on. And it's based on this idea that they've been unfairly treated in history. But I just see parallels here between Germany in the 1930s and them being unfairly treated at the Treaty of Versailles. And obviously we know how that ended. And I can only hope that this doesn't end the same way. But the way that China's acting over the South China Sea, the way they're acting over Taiwan, and the way they're still referring to Japan as the enemy, as if Japan is still the same World War II power that brought destruction to China. If China continue on this way in the next few years, we're not going to see an improvement in relations.
This brings us back to kind of where we started on the international stage, though, just to round out this long conversation we're having, and where with Sam Lewis. Appreciate his time. There's a gap here because their mouthpieces and their media supporters will say that they are not expanding, they are not imperialistic, they're not interested in all that. But as you just laid out, their actions tell us something very different. And this is really at the core of the international problem that we have, where they're not going to change. The international community doesn't have a lot of method to make them change, but conflict is inevitable. So to ask the impossible question, so now what?
Well, I think, as much as what I just said was quite scary, we shouldn't be too worried. The fall of the USSR in the 1990s and the sudden increase in democracies that ultimately resulted was a high point. But, there's a gentleman called Francis Fukuyama. I'm not sure if you heard of his end of history thesis, but the idea is that, the geopolitics is done, that there'll be no more real international conflict on a big scale because, all the nations will come together. And I think that sort of shows a hubris that existed in the Clinton years and the early Bush years. The idea that peace is normal, and that's just not the case. Peace is the exception. War is unfortunately the norm throughout history, and borders change. Sometimes nations are on a spectrum of democracy, so we shouldn't be too worried. But we should just forget the idea that China is going to be like us as a liberal democracy, which, don't forget, until 2018, until Trump launched the tariff war, we sort of thought China would go the same way as us. And we blinded ourselves in this ignorance of ours. But, there are two ways we can really look to combat China internationally, and to make sure that a lot of the world follows our lead or the West's lead and America's lead rather than China's lead. And that comes down to money and vaccinations. So China have their Belt and Road Initiative, and they use it to influence other nations. And very often, especially within Africa and South America, it's a case of accept Chinese money or don't grow at all, don't develop. And of course, if we were in their position, we'd probably say, well, you know what, we're going to go for the money. So we're going to go for, whatever China's stipulations are, and we're going to try and cozy up to China. But this is where the planned, Joe Biden's plan for Build Back Better World, which was announced at the G7 and what the G7 nations come up with, is quite a good idea. It's about offering transparent loans and offering an alternative to Chinese Belt and Road money. So this is something that could be explored within the following years. But more pressingly, is ultimately using our soft power, using vaccines. When Nicaragua very recently changed their recognizing Taiwan to recognizing China, it just so happened a week later they got 200,000 Sinovac COVID-19 vaccines. So China's using vaccines as soft power diplomacy to get the world to do what they want. And we should do the same. Our vaccines are way better. Pfizer and Moderna are way better than Sinovac. But because a lot of these poorer countries have no alternative, they weren't able to get the contracts with the better firms to begin with, they go to China. So we have the better vaccines. We have the better transparent, loans. We should use it, and we should try and, get into these countries and show that we're still there, that we still want to be their friend and be their ally. And I think the Donald Trump years, whatever you thought of him, didn't necessarily do much for the allies around the world. A lot of people lost faith in America, and that has to sort of be brought back slowly. And I think that, those are two particular ways. So money, vaccines.
One last quick question before we let you go, Sam Lewis. You mentioned the Soviet Union, the fall of it. We know that was a two-pronged fall. It was economic, but the part that doesn't get discussed a lot was it was cultural, the changing technology. We were able to get cultural differences in there. Is there any chance? We know the economic might of China is not going anywhere, and probably for at least the next generation. Is there any chance of culture breaking through the Great Red Firewall?
Well, look, if you go to China, they have McDonald's everywhere. They have H&M everywhere. They love NBA. They love American culture. They love Western culture. They absolutely adore it. And the fact is that in recent years, that's sort of started to change. But younger people in China still love it. But slowly by slowly, as part of the nationalistic campaigns run by the Chinese Communist Party, they're going for Chinese brands over Western ones now. So, I mean, especially with culture, it's quite tough for governments to intervene. This is something that just sort of happens by osmosis if it's allowed. So, unfortunately, I don't think there is a way around the Chinese firewall. China has ultimately been able to block off, for example, there's only a certain number of Western films that are allowed into the Chinese cinema market. And they have to be pre-approved. And that's why you see, for example, Mission Impossible succumbing to Chinese demands and getting rid of the Taiwanese flag on Tom Cruise's back. And that's the unfortunate thing. But, we'd have to be confident in the West. We have to be confident in ourselves, and not be sorry and not censor everything just because we want to get into the Chinese market. And it has to start at home. It has to start with our businesses saying, well, you know what, we don't need China, as South Park did a couple of years ago. And Chinese people still love South Park, and because it's banned, they find VPNs and they watch it instead. But the NBA needs to grow a spine. Other companies like Apple and Tesla need to grow a spine, and focus on the Western market, and ultimately then it will go through into the Chinese market.
Yeah. Wish we had another hour. We could still dig into it because you know what you're talking about. And that's what we like to do here. We like to turn down the noise and get to the information. And you, my friend, give good information. So, Sam Lewis, let folks know where they can follow you and what you've got working on, both Young Voices and other mediums, so folks can find you.
Yep. So if you want to on Twitter, my hashtag is my handle is at East Asia Insider. That's also the name of my blog. So if you type in on Google East Asia Insider, you can find a website with my image on it, and a couple of the articles I write and all the media appearances I do. I've got a couple of books in the work, both a novel, but both are set in China. The first one should be coming out in January or February. So that's called Eyes to the East. If any of you see it in bookstores near you, please let me know and I can get you a signed copy. But there's a few things in the works, and China is becoming ever increasingly important in all our lives. So I hope to be focusing on it for a few years to come.
Yeah, and we will definitely want to have you back on to talk about it more, especially in the coming year with the Olympics and other things. We're not going to have a reft of things to not talk about on China. He's going to be first and foremost. So, Sam Lewis, thank you so much for the time today, my friend. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, sir.